Friends, welcome. My name is Shaka Cummings. I am the manager of equity and K-12 policy at the Prichard Committee, a nonprofit education advocacy organization focused on improving education outcomes for students across the Bluegrass. As a part of our Equity Lens campaign, we have Jessica Klanderud with us. She currently works at Berea College and she wears multiple hats. She's the director of the Carter G. Woodson Center at Berea College, and she's also an assistant professor of African and African American Studies. Jessica, welcome. Thank you so much for some time today. We certainly appreciate it. And I would love for you to maybe deeper dive into your background because it's definitely an interesting one. Could you please share with us a little bit about who you are and where you come from?
Of course, thank you for having me. So I would say I'm a teacher first and foremost. So my bachelor's degree was actually in history education at Western Michigan University. And I continued that work for a number of years teaching high school history. So I taught 10th grade primarily, and AP World History were the two classes I did the most of. And then after a while working in the secondary system, I got restless and decided that I wanted to be able to pursue more of my own research interests. And so I went back to graduate school at Carnegie Mellon University in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. So back home to Appalachia, and I majored in history there and African American history specifically, and I received my master's and PhD from Carnegie Mellon University. Following my work there, I had my first assistant professorship out in central Kansas, where I was teaching primarily pre-service teachers, preparing them for their career in education as well. And then I recently have relocated to Kentucky. And as you said, I'm now the director of the Carter G. Woodson Center for Interracial Education at Berea College, as well as an assistant professor in African and African American Studies.
Jessica, such an awesome background. As a former history teacher, I certainly appreciate the beginnings because we have very similar beginnings. And as a classroom teacher, as well as an assistant professor, equity obviously is a part of the work that you do on a regular basis. How would you define equity?
So I want everyone's story to be told. I want everyone to have access to their story and access to their history. And that's not always very easy. When we think about the variety of learners that we have in a classroom, whether it be at the PK level all the way up to higher ed, everyone needs to be able to hear their story in a way that they can respond to. And so that's why it's so important that we continue to talk about equity in the classroom, because accessing the history of our nation, it's not just one-sided. Everyone has a role to play. Everyone has a part that they were involved in. And especially when you look at the history of the state of Kentucky, it isn't just one story, it's multifaceted. And I think the more sides of that story we can bring in, the more beautiful the picture really is, because it's more accurate and more true. And so for me, that's why equity is particularly important in the classroom, is to help expose everyone to those stories, because we learn more about ourselves by learning more about other people.
A beautiful sentiment. And as I think about the work that you've done as a classroom teacher, one of the mechanisms for ensuring that equity is represented in the classroom is culturally responsive teaching. Could you talk to us a little bit about what culturally responsive teaching is and how it can show up in public education classrooms?
Sure. So one of the things that I think about when I talk about culturally responsive teaching is really being able to use some of the language of the classroom, differentiate instruction in a way that speaks to all of the learners in your classroom. And so this can be language, this can be culture, this can be racially relevant. And in fact, I'm really emphasizing right now more in my work anti-racist teaching practices, because there are ways that race and racism show up in our world beyond just the interpersonal relationships. We have to think about how there are structures and systems in play that continue to recreate the idea, for example, of race as biology rather than race as a social construct. So being able to think about how those things show up in things like housing policy. Um, it isn't necessarily that your bank is being personally racist against you. It's that the systems that are in play from the origins and foundations of things like mortgage banking are continuing to function in the way that they were designed. And so we have to actually talk about them. We have to talk about the legal system. We have to talk about the social structures. We have to talk about, all of the different ways that these things come together, and in a way that is open for discussion, in a way that is empathetic, culturally sensitive. Those things are a part of your teaching practice when you're practicing culturally responsive teaching.
And as we think about culturally responsive teaching, as we think about equity in terms of public education, why is it so important that we have these conversations? Why is it important that culturally responsive teaching, that equity show up in public education classrooms in the Bluegrass?
Yeah, I will give an example of why I think this is so important. So one of the things that I do at Berea is I lead biannually a civil rights tour. And in that tour, we go to various sites in the South primarily and talk about the civil rights movement. My particular research area is in the civil rights movement at this point. And so it has been really eye-opening for me to be able to take my colleagues and my students on this journey with me. One of the things that I think is a frequent misconception about the civil rights movement in general, especially in the 60s, but I would argue that the civil rights movement is continuing today. It looks a little different because, history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. We have to, continue to look at how it's happening today. But the civil rights movement would not have been successful without interracial coalition building. And so one of the things that I think people frequently think of is, we think of leaders like Martin Luther King, we think of leaders like Malcolm X, and we put them in opposition to each other because, they were always fighting. When in reality, both men were very interested in the advancement of the race as far as they were concerned, but also they didn't disagree to the degree that we sometimes assume. But even so, the civil rights movement was a movement of people at the grassroots. It was not something that was even terribly leadership driven. Being able to kind of point to leaders made it easier for the movement to be undermined. It made it easier to call into question the morality and the kind of structures of it, but the actual day-to-day efforts were happening among the people. And they were happening among Black and white, people of the Latinx community, people of the gay and lesbian community. All these people were involved in this push for broader access to human rights. And so we kind of began with this emphasis on civil rights, and we end up moving into this emphasis on human rights. And I think that so much of the work right now that is trying to question how we talk about these hard histories, how we talk about these difficult subjects, is really trying to do two things. It's trying to undermine our connection to each other, undermine our empathy across difference. And in fact, many of the legislative plans that have been introduced around the country, including in Kentucky, emphasize this idea that no student should be made to feel discomfort. And for me, when I think about that, that is really where culturally responsive teaching comes into play, because the goal of culturally responsive teaching is to build empathy across difference. And so if you are building empathy, yes, you may feel discomfort, but that discomfort is there to prod you into thinking about how you can engage with someone who is different than you. Like, I'm not comfortable in the situation, but oh wow, like that was a terrible thing that happened to people that look like you. What can I do? How can I contribute? How can I partner with you in building a stronger human rights understanding where everyone is included equally? And I think that that's the kind of lens we should think about when it comes to thinking about how to engage. in the classroom is how do we come together? How do we build a strong and stronger human family? As King said, how do we build that beloved community? How do we build the world house? These are the ideas that I think should be a part of our thinking in terms of how we all engage in these questions.
And as we think about that engagement, what are some of the barriers that you see in the work that you do and in the research that you're doing in terms of really building the competencies around equity in public education?
I think the greatest barrier is just miscommunication and misunderstanding. Because so much of our understanding of history has been politicized in ways that I feel are really unhelpful. We have, factions, we have camps set up where folks are arguing for particular types of history, particular approaches to history. And there's a whole range of understanding. I mean, as a historian by my own training, any topic that you look up, there's whole different camps of historiography, whole different camps of how historians have talked about it, and they don't always agree with each other. And I think getting into those debates and being able to see how there is no kind of one uniform story. We have to get to the evidence. We have to get to those primary sources. We have to get to the truth of it all as much as we can. And I think that comes from listening to people's experiences. It comes from being open to hear about something that you aren't familiar with. I mean, open to learning. And I think that should be the goal of education. But of course, when there is a politically prioritized view, it doesn't always leave room for those growing conversations to happen. I mean, when you think about all the teachers in the classrooms that are using inquiry method, the purpose, the reason inquiry method works and the reason it's great is because we shouldn't be telling students what to think. We need to show them how, give them the tools to walk down the road and see for themselves what the answer is. And I personally am not afraid of them doing that inquiry. I think that there is much for them to see and much for them to learn. And I am not in the business of telling my students what to think. I'm in the business of showing them where the sources are and helping them to gain that skill for themselves, because that's what makes the kind of citizens that we need in a democracy. And that's what will make our whole community stronger as a whole.
Jessica, incredible conversation. Thank you so much for bringing your expertise to the Equity Lens campaign. And thank you so much for sharing your expertise around culturally responsive teaching and equity. We so appreciate the time. Thank you, thank you, thank you.
Thank you.